Thank you, Ariane. Hi, everyone. I'm Sandra Waddock from Boston College and author of the book Intellectual Shamans. And as most of you know, this series tries to introduce us to interesting ideas and new ways of thinking and new people. And today I'm really, really excited to introduce you to Nicola Robins. Nicola she's not an academic like us. She's a consultant and an initiated diviner in one of South Africa's indigenous traditions. And she hopefully will be giving us a little bit more background on that, on what a diviner is and how that works and how she has brought that experience into her work as a consultant over many years since she's been initiated, and even before that, I've just read her book, and it's a really remarkable experience. And so, as usual, what we're going to do is we will let Nicola talk she has a presentation for us. We'll let her talk for about half an hour. Please put your questions into the chat, and then we'll get to them afterwards, and I'll call on people to unmute themselves and ask their own questions so that I don't have to paraphrase it. And Michael, if you could, would you like to introduce IHMA just a little bit?
Yeah, good morning, everybody, and welcome. IHMA, the International Humanistic Management Association, is the host of this wonderful series that Sandra Waddock has been hosting for many, many years. And as you said, Sandra, the idea is to spread ideas that ultimately support the protection of dignity and the promotion of flourishing. And so that's the framing that we use. And with that, basically, I just want to invite you to check IHMA out. The website we'll put in place. If you want to support us, you can become a member. If you have ideas of what to do, let us know. But I just thank you for being here. Back over to Sandra.
Okay, and remember, everyone, just put questions as they occur to you, put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as possible afterwards. Nicola, over to you.
Thanks so much, and huge thanks for the invitation. It's lovely to be here, Sandra, and thank you to everyone who joined. It's good to see you all. So I'm not really going to talk about how I integrate this into my work, although it's kind of there by implication. If you want to know more about that, you generally can read the book. That's kind of what the book is about. But I'm going to dive into an aspect of something that I think is kind of back in the conversation. Certainly in the States, it hasn't really left the conversation in Africa over the last few hundred years, but war is what we're going to be talking about. And in particular, the idea or the phenomenon of war ancestors. And the subtitle is How Societies Learn to Live with Rupture. And the starting point of what we're going to look at today kind of came from Prime Minister Mark Carney last month in the World Economic Forum at Davos. And you probably heard his speech. It was quite widely reported. It was probably one of the better, in fact, the best speeches. It was quite a phenomenal speech at the WEF. And Mark Carney started his speech off with something quite pivotal, I thought. He said something to the effect of, let's be clear, this is not transition, this is rupture. And Mark Carney is not a particularly wild chap. I mean, he's a banker, he's conservative, he headed up the Financial Stability Board. He isn't really known for sort of overblown statements or, the woo-woo sort of thing. He's quite a grounded fellow. And so his naming of this thing called rupture, I thought was quite significant at this time. And I got to thinking about what is the difference between those two things, transition versus rupture. And we can see in general terms that when most people in my space, in the sustainability consulting field, speak about transition, we've got in our minds some kind of continuity, some idea of from here to there, right? Something that's going to be coming forward in the future. And that along the way, we're probably going to be having to manage change to some degree. But we can almost think about it as a sort of a bridge. But rupture is entirely different to that. Rupture changes the picture. When we speak rupture or when we think of rupture, what goes down is something that rips away what is familiar to us, those things we've come to rely on, those things that give us stability. And what happens in rupture is something that begins to crack the surfaces of what is all around us. It begins to crack the ground. And through those cracks, in quite unpredictable but quite astounding ways, we are seeing things filtering through that perhaps we didn't expect, that were perhaps associated with past things, things that were unresolved. And what happens when these things begin to filter through in unpredictable ways is that they reorganize the present. They start literally changing the possibilities of our reality. And this is really the difference, and it is hugely significant. And I'd like to speak about one other thing just to set the frame for this. And I've named it Beyond the Binaries. Now, binaries, for most of us who are trained, brought up, born, schooled in what I call North Atlantic modernities, and you could say Western as well, if you like. I just like the idea of North Atlantic, and you'll see why. So most of us who are schooled or trained in these modernities or this modernity rarely love binaries because they give us that stability, precisely that stability that is being ripped away at the moment. So we love these binaries. They make us feel stable. They make us know which way is forward. We kind of know which is wrong and which is right. And they are such a relief. They are a comfort, an immense comfort. And they're also something that gets in the way of the kind of clear-sighted insight that is required for navigating rupture. And I'm going to speak about one of those binaries today, which you probably will recognize as well. And that is the binary between the idea of indigenous knowledge on the one hand and modernity on the other. So when people talk about or hear about indigenous knowledge, in their mind is often some kind of idea of romanticized harmony. It's all quite wise and wonderful. It's quite kumbaya. It's kind of perfection. And this is, for many people, what indigenous knowledge evokes in their mind. And if you know more about indigenous knowledge, you're probably not going there. But a lot of people who are talking and exploring about indigenous knowledge at the moment might still have this view, and is still quite widely promoted. On the other hand, modernity is seen as something very scientific, all extraction, all excess, all externality. It might be clever, but it's definitely not seen as wise. And so this is quite a stark binary that has filtered into our understanding of reality. And where I'm going with this is that many indigenous societies extracted a surplus. They expanded their territory. They innovated technologically, all things we might loosely associate with the idea of modernity. However, they were not the same kind of modernity. So they had this modernity in effect in terms of extraction of surplus, storage of surplus, management of surplus, allocation of surplus. But this was done in a way that was profoundly informed with ritual, animism, and what I call here ethical incorporation. In other words, extraction just didn't take place willy-nilly, as fast as possible, in as extractive way as possible. It was played out and controlled and managed within quite different constraints to extraction in our current modernity. So my suggestion here is that they were in effect overlapping modernities. They weren't invented in the North Atlantic region, they were overlapping. The modernities that I speak about broadly as indigenous modernities were largely destroyed by colonialism.
Nicola, I think you've
Yes.
lost, at least my computer has lost your PowerPoint.
Oh no.
Is that the
Anyone
case?
else lost it?
I'm fine.
Yeah,
It's okay. Mine is fine.
I'm seeing it.
Oh, that's fine.
Mine's fine.
Okay, I think we've probably got enough. I think Nora started.
I'm not sure.
My point here is that there were overlapping modernities, and only one of them informs our current response to rupture. So I'm going to start with a story and then end up in, sort of move into a story about rupture. And I'm going to take you back to 19th century South Africa, or Southern Africa. And it is about a rupture that took place in one of these indigenous African modernities. And it was about the expansion of the Zulu kingdom. So this was starting early 19th century. What was happening at the time was an expansion of trade and trade routes. Trade had been going on for centuries beforehand, of course, but now we have an expansion of trade for various reasons. We've got, on the basis of that trade, growing power asymmetries. We've got military innovation taking place. You'll have probably on Netflix perhaps seen about Shaga. That's one of the sort of recognized military strategists in Africa. And at the same time, what happened in that area was a significant drought. So put that all together and you have effectively the conditions for war. And it was a devastating war that unfolded across Southern Africa, or large parts of Southern Africa. The elders at the time referred to it as the scattering of people, the scattering of reality in many senses. And what happened was, the elders say the dead lay unburied on the ground. So what that meant was that the rituals for burying the dead were not carried out. And what happened next really, really mattered, because the kind of general truism, I think, about modernities is that when events overwhelm our ritual capacity, we can say that rupture enters the social body. Rupture becomes present in some way. So to tell you about what happened next, I'm going to tell you one thing about Ngoma understanding of illness, and this comes from Harriet Ngubane, who is an anthropologist. She wrote in the 70s, and this is probably the definitive work on body and mind in Zulu medicine. And what Ngubane said is that in Ngoma, in these cultures, illness is not merely individual or biological, but also a symbol of wider social imbalance. Now, that probably sounds perfectly logical to most of the people on this call, I venture, but it is not how we think about illness, broadly speaking, in the West. It is seen, by and large, as a very individual affair, and we don't think about it like that. And what happened a few decades after this war is that people in Southern Africa noticed that there was a new kind of sickness around. This sickness seemed to be strangely resistant to the usual cures. And so the diviners, who are also the healers, began to innovate in search of a cure for this new kind of sickness. And in that process of effectively ritual innovation, we see the emergence in Southern Africa of a new kind of ancestor. What actually happened was the ancestral genealogies began to change to accommodate this new kind of sickness and the ancestor that gave rise to it. And the name of this was war ancestors. The Zulu word Amadlozi Akuhlasela, if you translate that, it literally means invading ancestors. One of my teachers told me to think about it like shrapnel. This is what happens when war ancestors appear in the body, or the body of society. So again, I think most of you have a sense of ancestors and ancestral traditions if you're often coming on intellectual shaman webinars. But just to say, yes, ancestors are grandmother and grandfather and all the way back through your lineage. But in many ancestral traditions, they are not just that. If we look at many ancestral cultures, including those in Africa, the idea of ancestors is far more fluid and nuanced than just grandmother or grandfather. It is about to what degree and how the past might influence our present. So it doesn't have to be a biological person. It can simply be a presence, something that is influencing us from the past. And the ancestral energy takes place around that and begins to impact us in ways we can't often anticipate. So this is when extraction and war outpace the ethical architecture. This is another view on how we can see this process taking place in the 19th century Southern Africa. We might also say that new forms of agency emerge. Things that didn't previously impact us suddenly do. It is a rupture where things begin to filter through cracks and express in new ways that take and enact agency in ways we couldn't have anticipated. So this is why I'm suggesting, there's an interesting correlate here. It's not necessarily the same, of course, but there is something we might refer to as ancestors of rupture, war ancestors, something that might be relevant to us today. So the question then we can ask broadly is how did Ngoma respond to this as a set of practices, as a science that was really organizing the indigenous modernities in Southern Africa? That's what Ngoma was. Ngoma was and is a knowledge system. And it was reorganizing, or it reorganized, or it organized knowledge in response to whatever was going on. And we can see through what happened, through the reports, through what elders say, through what people say, at least three kinds of organizations that took place in response to this new experience of reality, these new kinds of ancestors, this new sense, in a way, of rupture. And I'm calling them accommodations, all right, because the idea of accommodation is not that easy to explain, but it's based in this whole idea I mentioned earlier, this idea of ethical incorporation, putting something inside, to bring it in, to find a place to it. This is a different impulse, this impulse of accommodation. It's very different to exclusion. It's about saying, this thing is here. It doesn't feel great. It doesn't feel what we'd want. It's not familiar, but we need to find a place for it in order for reality to continue, in order for us to find a way forward together. It refers to, in some ways, the Tswana term khobewa, if anyone is Tswana here, and I'd probably not, but there's a term khobewa, which means to be seated at the table. And the whole idea is anything that is present and impacting us must find a seat. Now, that's not by whim, it's not just made up, it is not just any place, it is the rightful place. And finding the rightful place of new realities typically requires what we might call a complex act of reorganization. So that's the sense that I'm using when I say Ngoma reorganized in response to rupture. And there were three broad reorganizations we could see. The first was around accommodating what we might call these ancestors of rupture or war ancestors. The second was about accommodating justice. Justice becomes critical in times of war and in times of rupture. And the third is about accommodating uncertainty, the sense that during rupture, unpredictability goes through the roof. How did Ngoma reorganize in response to these things? And here I'm doing a little bit of a dangerous thing, but I'm kind of looking back and putting it into two sentences, which you all know is very unwise, but bear with me, this is a very sort of high-level view, with a view to a conversation. So what I've done is I've set up one of those difficult binary-looking tables which looks at what happened then and perhaps what happens now. It's not a strict binary. It's just really looking at what is happening now in terms of the dominant experience of reality we have now. So what was rupture then? How did Ngoma respond? What is rupture now? And how are we responding from a dominant paradigm? Well, as I said, for Ngoma people and for Ngoma practitioners, ancestors were part of how this new reality expressed itself. What they had to do was create rituals which would appease those ancestors, which would calm those ancestors, which would acknowledge their presence and find their rightful place. Now, the rightful place for war ancestors is into the body of society. It is literally, that ancestor literally finds a place through ritual into the identity of the individual or the identity of the collective. And this is done through very careful, very painstaking rituals that we just know work because it feels right. It's kind of hard to put that across in a sense to cultures who don't necessarily work like that. But we could certainly find a way to explore a correlation in our own experience. The second Ngoma response was, as I said, about justice. And it was the concept of restorative justice, which often requires some kind of gift, some kind of giving, some kind of payment, which prevents social fragmentation. So remember, there are victors in this war. There are those who are conquered in the war. Those people need to find a rightful place in society. This is very much going back to the idea of a person is a person through other people. This is the collective idea of Ngoma, or which you might have heard through concepts of Ubuntu. So this need to address the potential for social fragmentation was significant. And so new restorative justice rituals emerged at this time. And there was a third degree of innovation, if you like, which was in the space of divination, and in particular in the forms and the depth and intensity of diviner training. Up to this time, diviner training was often passed on in families. It was a relaxed affair. It wasn't that intensive. But as unpredictability spiked in the wake of this experience of rupture, diviner training accelerated. It got way more complex, the ritual of the training itself. And what happened is those people who were trained as diviners, and they had all experienced affliction of these ancestors to some degree, would then return to the communities trained to help people make sense in uncertainty. So, if you like, a rapid acceleration of learning in response to uncertainty and how to manage it and how to make better decisions in relation to it. And I'm going to contrast that with what I see now in effect the dominant modernity. How are we responding now? Well, it's very, very different. We are quite clearly seeking to extract more and faster. I mean, I think we can find places that are trying not to do this and are trying to address it. But I think as uncertainty and the intensity of the current times appears faster and faster, there's a move back into almost, sort of unconstrained extraction. I mean, certainly seeing this in the US to some extent and in other areas as well. So we are seeing the emergence of unfinished relationships reshaping our behaviors. I think for many people in the global north who thought that actually war was over, 10 years ago or 20 years ago or something in the past, right? It's suddenly war, as I said, was back on the agenda. When we think about extraction and unfinished relationships, think modern slavery, think ecosystem destruction, think climate displacement, think militarized extraction taking place all over Africa, think cognitive warfare, think weaponized platforms. I mean, the real possibility, I think, of a new nuclear arms race emerging at this stage as a response, in effect, to rupture. In the second area, where Ngoma cultures would have focused on justice, I think we're seeing, certainly from the States, but not entirely alone, almost the emergence of another neo-imperial moment. Maybe declarations about Greenland, Russia and its moves, China's doing some very interesting things. But what we're seeing in general, I think, is an agreement very tacitly amongst the geopolitical powers of the world that says, well, in this context, perhaps justice entirely is deferred. And that's, again, something very different to what was happening in Ngoma cultures. And the third area, where Ngoma cultures radically trained and scaled their ability to make sense in uncertainty, I think we can recognize that for many executives, for many governments, for many people, for many families, our struggle to respond to deep uncertainty is getting no easier. We're not really finding an effective way forward. And in the space of this, we're effectively doubling down on our own modernity, on what seemed to work before, rather than standing back and saying, well, what might we learn from that is different, significantly different? And that's really my final question, I suppose, to you all, to say, what if, just what if, instead of doing that, instead of doubling down on what worked before in the hope that it might just do better next time, what if we slowed down a little? And there's a wonderful quote from a Nigerian philosopher, Bayo Akomolafe, who says, times are urgent, we must slow down, which I think really epitomizes what I'm suggesting here. Because perhaps for us, in business schools, in governance, in wherever we are, perhaps the question is less, what's our strategy for rupture? And more, what agency is being created by what we are doing? What agency is emerging by our response? And that's a very different question because it doesn't look at what we're doing right now. It looks at the context of what is emerging as we try to do what we do, because it becomes very important in rupture. And to make that contextual, you can just think of a system that you work in and ask questions like this. What violence does it normalize? There's an answer to that. I live in South Africa. So many of our systems normalize or repeat or reenact the violence of apartheid, even if it is unintentional. It is very difficult to stop doing that. Who inherits the consequences? It is very often the people who had the consequences before, the marginalized, the disempowered, the people who typically in Ngoma cultures became the afflicted. And thirdly, how might we rightly accommodate things? How might we accommodate things? Do we even know about that? Because this for us is such a different approach in a socially atomistic society, a society where we can say just social media really reinforces and increases that atomization. So how might we rightly accommodate things, find the rightful place of things? And I think these kinds of questions and these kinds of conversations, and this for me is very much a beginning, just early exploration. These conversations live at the interface of two very different modernities. The North Atlantic modernity that we are all familiar with because it has become, without a doubt, the dominant modernity in the world. And other modernities that still exist in highly adapted form, but you'll find them if you walk around taxi ranks in South Africa. You'll find them if you go to the market in the Philippines. There are these other modernities still expressing in action. And within those modernities, I suggest there are different lessons, there are different insights about how to work with extraction, with excess, and with the rupture that almost invariably results if we don't find ways to manage it properly. And that's really it from me. And that's the end of the talk. But yeah, really open to any questions or thoughts or comments. Yeah, please share.
Thank you so much. And you can maybe stop sharing your screen and we can go to a gallery way of viewing. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions. I actually would wonder if you would be willing to share a little bit about your journey as a consultant and ultimately as a diviner, and how you have begun to integrate those two very different ways of being in the world, because I think it's got to do with this healing that's needed to deal with rupture that we maybe all
Sure.
need.
Thanks, Sandra. And you're right. So rupture takes place at any level, right? You can experience it as an individual for sure. And so the story that I tell in my book, Diviner Mind, really tells that part of the story. It's an autoethnography. So you can probably see by now I'm a white South African. I'm a descendant of effectively colonial settlers during the late 1800s. My great-grandfather came to South Africa because he was a stonemason. He lived in Cornwall. And what was needed in South Africa was a new university, in effect, a colonial learning institution. Why did they need a university? Well, they needed to train geologists, they needed to train mining engineers, because a couple of decades earlier, they had discovered gold and diamonds. The British had, in fact, discovered gold and diamonds on the Witwatersrand in South Africa. So that's how I got to be here. It was essentially a pathway of colonialism on one hand and extraction, and a great-grandfather who knew how to cut rocks. And he cut the rocks that helped to build a colonial institution called University of Cape Town, which many people here would know about. So I got to be here, and I went to school, and I was at a very much a sort of what we call in South Africa the leafy suburbs. It's where white people grow up. I grew up in war, but until I was 9 years old, I was none the wiser. And that was literally possible. You could be living in a white suburb as a white person and a young person without asking any curious questions, and you would not know that a couple of kilometers away, South Africa was exploding in war. And I discovered that when I was 9 years old, I was at school, and it was an all-girls white colonial school. It's called Rustenburg Junior. And what happened was, apparently, the Black children were going to do a riot. Now, the teachers heard this. We didn't quite know what this meant, but it did mean that something very interesting was going on. This was 1976. If you know anything about South African politics, you will know this is when the learners in schools across the country erupted. In effect, one of the most biggest protests that South Africa has seen. It was the rise, a revolution of the children. The children had had enough why they were forced to learn in Afrikaans, and they were no longer prepared to do it. And so they carefully planned and strategized their demonstrations to align to interesting spaces. And that meant they were going to go along Rondebosch Main Road, which went right past my nice colonial girls' school. Of course, some of us were really interested in what this meant. We'd never kind of heard it, but it sounded interesting. And so a few of us, there were 3 of us, kind of sneaked through the hydrangea bushes and ended up at the front of the school fence, just against every law. We had to kind of be inside, but we just managed to get out. And there I kind of walked into what was the experience of a lifetime, 9 years old, and I came face to face with a young boy about my age. And there is something that happens when you look into the eye of someone else deeply, in a very, very human way. What they say in terms of the neuroscience is it drains your cognitive reserve. All those little pretenses that keep you going as if nothing is wrong suddenly disappear. And there I was, a 9-year-old white girl, realizing without a doubt that I stood on the wrong side of the fence. And so that was the beginning of a different kind of journey. And it took me all sorts of places. I got involved in the struggle. Thanks, Jess. I got involved in the struggle from the age of 13, which was a remarkable privilege because I had, in effect, what we might call a dual privilege in South Africa. I had, access to the spoils of white South Africa, right? I had a very easy life in that regard, but I also had access to freedom, to a liberation struggle that just blew my mind as a teenager. Anyway, I decided at some stage to study. I was going to be a lawyer, but I worked out that by the time I'd finished my law degree, I think the revolution would be won. And so I stopped law. It was hell of a boring anyway. And I studied environmental science and I studied economic history. And I ended up as a sustainability consultant. And a few years later, I found myself in Australia. I had done my master's degree at Yale University in industrial ecology, and I ended up actually advising a diamond mine, Argyle Diamonds, in the Kimberley Mountains, which is northwest of Australia. And there I heard something that I'd never thought possible. I was advising them about how to improve their environmental management techniques and their management of chemicals and all that sort of thing. And walking along the mine with the mine manager, I suddenly heard a voice that seemed to come from nowhere. And it said, "This mine is sacred. Nothing can justify what's being done to the earth." Clear as a bell, absolutely impossible. And so I forgot it. But my body did not forget it. I mean, it was so impossible that I had to forget it, right? This is the way of us. We're able to override what our body hears. Our mind can override actually quite easily. And so I thought I was fine. I was feeling stressed, but I got back to Cape Town and things started to go badly wrong, very badly wrong. I began to see things and experience things I didn't think were possible. So my well-trained scientist, from Yale, started to think I was going mad. I was in therapy, wasn't working. Therapist was nervous. She got to the point where she said, it's professionally, she cannot continue to advise me unless I go onto heavy medication. And every single part of my body said, don't do that, it's wrong. And by this stage, I had this very, very strong intuitive sense that if I made a mistake, it would be devastating. And that's how I ended up training as a diviner in the Fonto lineage of Ngoma in Southern Africa. And it was a very intense 4-month training. And the trainings and this way of training and this way of being in Southern Africa is actually the cure for the nature of the illness I had. It not only cures the illness, it trains you in a way of sense making. As I said, this is the diviner training that emerged about 200 years ago. And so this training enabled me to go back to society. And there unfolded a major paradox, which is essentially the theme of the book, which is that you are meant to return this knowledge to your community. This is how it's meant to ripple into the society to address the rupture. And my question was, how do I return this knowledge with integrity to a community that is deeply implicated in erasing the knowledge, and to a set of businesses that is part of scaling the extraction that creates it? So that's really what I explored, was how I could both meet my obligation as a diviner, or a sangoma, as we call it in Southern Africa, but yet not extract the knowledge, not to take it out of context, because if we do that, the knowledge is worthless. This is indigenous knowledge. It is relational. It is hyper-contextual. And it is based on relations that you cannot bring with you into the boardroom. So how do we do it? And the rest I'll leave to your imaginations.
I was just if you could give us a little bit of insight into how you do that, because it's this intuitive sense of a different way of knowing and a different way of seeing. That's what the shaman or the ngoma does. That's, I mean,
Okay, I'll carry on. I'll carry on. So what I realized was, and I will give you the nutshell, right? So sorry about this, another spoilers. But what I realized was you can't bring divination practice into the boardroom. I mean, technically you can. I know how to throw the bones. I know how to work with a group of people who are struggling in uncertainty and begin to look at what's material. The bones are all sorts of things. They are, shells and this and that, but they're little things that are objects that represent aspects of material reality. When we work with the bones, we throw them and we look at the patterns that emerge, and we begin to tell a story, not just the diviner himself or the diviner herself, but we are drawing on the insight and the intelligence and the natural pattern recognition capability that is present in the room. This is the process of divination, historically always a social act. So of course, technically, I could have reinvented myself as a corporate shaman and happily gone back to the boardroom. It was a time of Ubuntu, and everyone sort of loved the African stuff. And in the same way that my body said no to psychiatric medicine, and I'm not against it, it just, my body said no to it in my context. In the same way, I had this absolute clarity that intuitively this was wrong. It was even stronger for the idea of taking this product, this practice, this ritual from Ngoma and, trotting it into the boardroom. And I know I could have made lots of money, and people do, and I have no judgment, but I couldn't do it. It didn't sit with my training. And how would I do it then? Because I had at the same time the strong obligation, the sense of I'm so grateful, because I wasn't only cured, I was sort of, super cured. My life just changed radically. And eventually what I did was I became aware of complexity science, and particularly the work of Dave Snowden, who is a complexity scientist. I think he's one of the leading thinkers in what we might call naturalized sense making. That's what he calls it. It's a particular school of complexity science that draws quite significantly on indigenous knowledge. It's informed by it, and he takes it very seriously, and he uses it to inform his practices and the methods that he uses. And one of the things Dave speaks about is that you cannot simply scale something in a complex system, because that's what businesses are interested, right? How do you scale this? How do you scale this? Blah, blah, we've got to grow, blah, blah. And so what Dave Snowden said was, I thought, quite profound. And he said, if you want to scale in a complex system, you have to decompose that thing or that action to what he says is the lowest level of coherent granularity. You've got to pull it apart. So you've got to be able to pull something apart in an intelligent way. And then you've got to recombine those elements in the new context for it to work. And this for me was like a little light bulb moment, because I suddenly realized I knew what divination was about. I could reverse engineer my process of doing it. And so I split it into 3 cognitive capabilities. And they're nothing you wouldn't know. I mean, the one is intuition. This is trained deeply when we go into diviner training, very intensively and not in very nice ways, but it's trained very cleverly. The second is pattern analysis, right? So what pattern analysis does, it just shows us what's happening in the past, what's happening in the emerging present, and that gives us insight into the future. And the third is storytelling, which apparently is kind of quite important in the world these days. People realize storytellers are important. They're really back, which is great. But it's not just storytelling, right? So if you're looking at Ngoma, if we're looking at this framework, which I call diviner mind, these are 3 distinctive cognitive capabilities that work together in a tension. You can think about it like a triangle. It's not like one goes first, the next goes. No, they're all happening together at the same time. These are innately human cognitive capabilities, and diviners are taught to blend them and bring them forward in a collective sense, in a very distinctive way, in a very powerful way. And suddenly I thought, well, let me make sure those 3 capabilities are there in every workshop I begin to do. Let me look at the healing elements. Sandra, you mentioned that. The fragilities. What makes life impossible? In Ngoma cultures, we call it kulisile, which means they have not, we often translate it as they've healed me, but often what it means is I am now unfettered. This is a very old-fashioned word. You can see this comes from the 200 years ago. If you are unfettered, those things that stand in the way of what you need to do are now no longer bound barriers. So we are unfettered. So this is what happens in diviner training. You are unfettered, or you are healed, and then you're taught these skills in a very intensive way. So I wasn't obviously about to do any kind of healing rituals with businesses. They don't belong there. But what we can do is we can look at the fragilities in the system that get in the way of people making better decisions. And I mean decisions in service of life. And so I was able to really design processes that people enjoyed. I didn't say they were African. I didn't say they were ritual. I didn't say they were Ngoma or Indigenous, because that almost always leads us into the performative, into extractive things, into a cultural appropriation. But I was able to know that I was working as a sangoma or as a diviner. So I was able to manage that paradox a little bit.
That resonates with my teacher's notion who was also trained initially in multiple ways, but by an African Sangoma, and he doesn't believe that you need any of the rituals to do the work. You need the skills. I love the synthesis of the skills. I want to turn over to a couple questions that have come in from the audience. So Ravi, you had I think a couple of questions you might want to ask. You want to unmute yourself and frame your own questions?
Maybe you can read it. Your voice is better than mine.
Oh, let me find it. The first question was, Clayton Christensen's notion of disruptive technologies are innovations that begin as modest low-end alternatives and gradually reshape entire industries. But rupture refers to sudden dramatic discontinuities like earthquakes or tsunamis or wars that break systems abruptly rather than transforming them over time. If ruptures are inherently unpredictable and instantaneous, what disciplines, sensing mechanisms, or mindsets can leaders cultivate, or leaders, I'd say anyone, to perceive weak signals of impending discontinuity? Go ahead. So that's Ravi's first question.
Thanks, Ravi. And I like Clayton Christensen's stuff. I think it's clear. I think he uses the term disruptive innovation in a very careful way. He uses the term to speak to what can emerge over time through innovation. What he doesn't say is we must seek disruption through our innovation intentionally. It is as if the innovation he seeks begins as a small thing, as you put it, and then it begins to scale itself over time. And I think this is very important. And actually, this is quite consistent with where Ngoma has gone in terms of innovation. Because Ngoma thinks in adaptive ways. They adapt what is. They make little adaptations all the time in the direction of serving life. In Ngoma, we call it umoya, the breath of life. It has to serve life. And this is not disruptive by nature, but it can become radical over time. So I tend to avoid the term disruption, but I do like the way Clayton Christensen uses it, which is not often what people are looking at when they look at disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation is often intended to disrupt the market in ways that are potentially going to increase unpredictability. And that's what makes it problematic at a time of rupture, in my view. Obviously, no one all agrees with this. But what can executives do or teams do? Well, the first thing is we're all innovative to some degree. I would say, secondly, that no executive got into the C-suite without innovation. They just, without intuition. They just don't speak about it in that sense very often, but they all might talk about gut feel, etc. So innovation intuition, I've got the word wrong. Intuition is present in everyone. And all we need to do is realize that it's invited, make it possible. And so intuition is there. Sorry, I keep on using the wrong word. Intuition is there. Pattern analysis is there. We're used to working with patterns. Storytelling is coming in. So I'm interested there that you see the third element of that diviner mind framework being present and actually emerging in, Wall Street Journal, etc., writing about storytelling and storytellers. So I think it's all there. And what we need to do is begin to ask questions that invite a surfacing of fragility and really trust that the people in the room who need to be diverse, and I'm talking cognitively diverse, with different experiences of that organization, of its value chain, they need to be there, and it needs to be possible for them to tell stories of their own experience. And so I'm taking this away from the idea of the diviner who kind of sprouts forth the truth, because this is where it's kind of come to. And I'm saying that the stories become little vignettes of people's experience on the ground. And so you don't have to do anything radical. You just have to create space for those stories to begin to emerge. And there are lots of ways to do that. You can seed it with patterns. You can create representative objects. You can ask people to, tell a story in the past and then in the present and then in the future about how something went wrong or it went radically right. So you can begin to invite them. What I've experienced in that, Ravi, is that when people do that, they feel very human. They feel very seen. They feel respected for their intelligence and not stuck in this sort of British machine of just, meeting some kind of return on investment or some narrow set of indicators that frankly makes them feel like they shouldn't be there at all.
Yeah, it's got to do with meaning and story. I've been reading some things about narrative lately, and a couple people have used the phrase homo neurons. We are storytellers by definition. Gerard, and then we'll move to Wavinda.
Wavinda, hi.
Thanks, Sandra. Thank you, Nicola. That was wonderful. I had my question. I had a couple of questions, but I just wonder, I see our current situation as a normal progression, particularly grounded on the notion of self-interest escalating to a level that. So I'm wondering whether we have to reverse the question here, that we need to cause a rupture rather than respond to one.
That's so provocative, Gerard. I love it. And the only thing I can say is maybe. And I can only say maybe because we never know the impacts of what we're going to do. Where I find myself going is, however, in a direction that feels or can seem more conservative than that. And the reason is that we are already in rupture. And what rupture does is it spikes unpredictability. And in order to make intelligent decisions, humans require a little bit of predictability. It helps us. It really gives us a handhold. So if you go back to looking at ancestral lineages, for example, these were handholds of predictability that people developed in times that they recognized that things were complex. They recognized, they wouldn't use that word necessarily, but they recognized that you couldn't fully predict. Of course, no one can predict the future. But when you have systems that give us a little bit insight into what to expect, it helps us make better decisions. And that naturalistic decision-making framework, this what I call diviner mind, becomes more possible. When we're operating in rupture upon rupture, and essentially this is what AI is doing in my view, is it's just, pushing those asymptotes, of extraction closer and closer into vertical. I think they're near vertical already. But what this does is it makes so much uncertainty, this realm of deep uncertainty, that our ability to hold on to anything erodes. And in that context, I'm not sure how useful it is to knowingly create rupture. I think we need to be radical without being disruptive. And how you work with that, I think, is going to be contextual. But I think managing that nuance and working out what it means in your context becomes extraordinarily important in times of extreme uncertainty.
Thank you, Nicola. Wavinda, and then we'll go to Jess.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure meeting you, Nicola.
Thanks for coming.
I love your work because this is a very important conversation we should have as a people, especially here in the continent, because the rapture is here and it's here with us. We can see it. And when I read your work, one of the things that I was scanning, because I just got to get the work just the other day, one of the things that you mentioned on the preface, and allow me just to read that quote: the very act of knowledge or technology transfer in rapidly changing times may become an act of innovation itself. And that is what, as a group of thinkers, emerging philosophers, who are part of the ngoma, because ngoma is a drum and it's a Swahili also word in the continent. I'm from Kenya, I'm calling now from Nairobi. And even in my work, I put a lot of African instruments, like my first book has the ngoma, as you're talking about it, because right now, what you're doing is the ancestors are back, and we are realizing we need to communicate not only as Africans, but people of the world. Because if we don't communicate as people who can think, as people who can see, and as people who can understand other cultures, the ancestral translation and how they live in us, because most of us right now are guided by the ancestral voice. They appear in our dreams. They appear in our insights. They appear even when we're drinking water. And these are things that we need to have a conversation before it gets to instability. So your work is very, very monumental in this era, day and age, because it actually answers to what I call capital violence, the economic war on African dignity. And this thing, what is it's building is there's a psychological unrest about knowledge transfer. How are we getting knowledge? And I love what you said is about addressing the rapture. And I think the rapture should be addressed very, very well and in a very civilized manner so that we don't go to war. Because if there's disruption, as you've alluded to, disruption has taken, as we've seen it, we are historians, we've seen what has happened in different historical moments where the rapture came out and people were not able to communicate. So thank you so much for inviting me here. And I want to know, how are you reconciling with the idea that the Sangomas are all over Africa, and in different African countries, they have different names? Because we have them here, some call them Mgangas, other people have different names. In Western Africa, they also have that. It's a continental thing. How do we reconcile that and make this part of history? Because it's not only the healer. When people think about Sangoma, they think about the physical healing. What about the spiritual healing? What about connection with the nature? Because we connect with nature a lot. What is our connection as Sangomas? Because all the people of the world are Sangomas in their own way, despite their culture, their positionality, and all that stuff. So I would really love to pick your thoughts on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Wavinya. And also just to say, and to out you a little bit, Wavinya's just published a book on something very related. So please share the name of your book, Wavinya, in the chat so people can see it. And she got a PhD, so congratulations. And I think you're talking about something really exciting. And I think that people are doing this already in their own ways. I mean, in a way, I would see intellectual shamans as an outreach from Sandra, but also from Boston College to do something like that. We are going to have different names. So I've used the word diviner, which, as we know, is a bit of a literary license, right? The word sangoma is, for some people, it comes with implications in South Africa. It's sometimes quite a heavy thing. So I use the word diviner to make it a little bit light. But all of these old ways and all of these deep trainings, these deep knowledge traditions that quite remarkably have survived 500 years of colonial erasure, they have survived. They've had to adapt, but they have survived. That makes them hell of a resilient. Most of them, and the ones that we're talking about, these sort of modern ways of sense making and ritual and healing, they only go back a few thousand years. These are not sort of tens of thousands of ancient things. These are recent. They are a response to what extraction required. I think we are doing it slowly through the work that you're doing, maybe the work that I'm doing, Sandra's doing. They're little contributions, and I'm feeling it and I'm seeing it. So I think you're naming a pattern that is going to take, gather momentum. And I would go back 50 years to the words of Steve Biko. And what Steve Biko said was, the great gift still has to come from Africa. And he was a man, he was a martyr, he was murdered by South African apartheid police 50 years ago, but he absolutely understood the crucial nature of having a deep structural understanding of society. He really deeply understood it. It was the path of Black consciousness. It was the path that wasn't taken by the African National Congress. Perhaps it was too radical. But it has come back 50 years later. And what I'm seeing and I'm hearing is that young Black African people in South Africa, and not just Black Africans, but all sorts of Africans, are beginning to remember again the words of Steve Biko, who was effectively silenced on some level by apartheid, but then essentially silenced again in the sort of post-apartheid states. Those words are still there. It is a spirit of something that is undeniable. So when he says the great gift still has to come from Africa, that's what I think of, what you're doing. And you call it different names as well. But this is a beginning of a momentum that I'm seeing undeniably. And I'm feeling it and seeing it across the continent.
I'd argue in agreement that shamans, the term I use, can be found in all cultures and in many different disciplines. And we don't call them that in the modern world today. Jess, you get the last question.
And it's a really small topic, but maybe one for people to take away, because it's definitely one I've been thinking about. But with this idea of ancestors of war and the repair going, making space with that, do you believe that we might be able to resolve the extractive and destructive mechanisms embedded in capitalism? And this might maybe the woman, I need to read her book. She may have some ideas on this, but would we be able to resolve this extractive and destructive mechanisms embedded in capitalism, or do we need to learn to release and make space for new ways?
Yes, that's a really small question, Jess.
Yes, it's really small in 1 minute.
Yeah, I'll give you the 1 minute answer. And that is, if I didn't think there was a possibility, I wouldn't bother to work in the space. So yes, I do. I believe that there is hope. There are lots of things that do it, and I work on patterns. I don't just sort of take hope as something that is very often the flip side of fear. I don't just hope because I fear so deeply. I base hope on the patterns that I'm seeing and feeling, both myself, but also in the people like Wavinya, what Sandra reports. This thing is happening in the world. And yet very clearly, Rupture has taken us to a space where it looks pretty hopeless. And that I also understand. So I think what's critically important is that we don't be naive. about what we're up against. We are in war, but that doesn't mean that war is the only solution. We have to take war seriously. We have to take war ancestors seriously. And while on many days I don't feel very optimistic, I do recognize hope. And I do recognize that humans are, when put under extraordinary pressure, and this is only just beginning, right? We haven't begun to feel the kind of pressure that some people feel in the world already. But when humans are put under extraordinary pressure, we can do some quite remarkable things if the space is open for us to use our deep, innate human collective intelligence. What that means is going to be contextual. So what that means in your space, in your home, in your business, in your business school, or wherever you are, maybe you're in the UN, I don't know. But what that means requires some serious engagement, some thought, some feeling into, some sensing. And yes, we have the ability to do it. Will it be capitalism as we know it? Absolutely not. It's going to be so profoundly different. But will it be assembled out of aspects that are present today? I have almost no doubt that it will, because that's the way of things. That's the way of innovation in times of rupture.
Thank you, and that's a great note to end on. I want to thank all of you for sticking with us. There were, Nicola, just for your information, there were 50 to 51 people here the whole time.
Thank you.
And thank you, Nicola, for an amazing, I'm going to say what Ravi put in the chat a little earlier. Wow. That was amazing. So thank you so much. And thank you all for coming, and hope to see you all next time.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.